Hello, it's Morris back here again with another video talking about the runes, charms, and cards of Axie Infinity Origins Season 2. And today we have Aquatic, or Aqua for short. So for Aqua, the signature buff is something called Bubble. So what Bubble does is that this Axie's single attack card deals bonus damage equal to 1.5% of the target's current HP stack. Turn into Bubble Bomb upon reaching 5 stacks. So you can see it's more of like a damage buff. And once you have basically 5 bubble stack, then it just automatically turned into bubble bomb. So effectively you actually lose your bubble buff and turn that into bubble bomb. And what bubble bomb is that it's a buff that cannot be dispelled. When this Axie uses a single attack card, bubble bomb detonates and deals 20 damage to all enemies. So it's an AoE kind of damage. Okay, so let's look at the Aqua runes. So first up is the rare runes, and the first one we have Way of Aquatic. So as usual, it's a one-off self buff where when the battle starts, this actually gains 1 bubble. And also it has like a passive attack buff where it says this Axie's attack card deals 10% bonus damage. So you can already see that Aqua is more about dealing damage, and there's this unique mechanic called Bubble. So I did a bit of a quick calculation. So you need 5 bubble stacks to get to a bubble bomb, and each bubble bomb does 20 damage, and assuming the opponent has 3 Axies, then each bubble bomb does 60 damage, and you need 5 bubbles to get to 1 bubble bomb. So effectively you can think of it as 1 bubble does 12 damage. And of course, we haven't taken into account the single attack buff of Bubble, which says single attack cards deals bonus damage equal to 1.5% of the target current HP per stack. And assuming the target has 40 HP, then basically 1 bubble will give you 6 bonus damage per single attack, which is not too bad. And next up we have Hardy Warrior, and now what it does is that this actually deals 25% bonus damage if the target's HP is above 60%. So it's a very strong early game kind of card. In this case, it's really about the target HP above or below 60%. If it's above, then you deal more damage. If it's below, then you just don't have that bonus damage. And if you want to make a simple assumption where you assume that, say, 40% of the time the target has above 60 HP, then basically this is like a 10% buff overall. But of course, you can choose when to use cards from the Axie with Hardy Warrior, so probably a bit more than 10% buff, just because early game is very important, and being able to knock out opponent's Axie earlier is definitely an advantage. Okay, next up we have Blunt Teeth. So Blunt Teeth is a new one, and it says this Axie's attack cards deal 30% less damage, but grant 1 bonus energy fragment per energy cost. So basically it only applies to attack cards, and it is kind of like a debuff to attack cards. You deal 30% less damage, but you do get 1 bonus energy fragment per energy cost. So basically it's like a double energy fragment gaining mechanism when this actually uses attack card. But of course there's this sacrifice of 30% less damage. So, and first thing that I can think of is that probably you want to use cards that gives you buffs, so focus on buffs or even debuffs as opposed to the pure attack value. So that's one angle to look at it. So for example, cards that gives you bubbles. And actually there are other cards that we've seen in reptiles where there are cards that attack yourself, and so in a way it kind of synergizes with those cards that actually is an attack card but attack yourself. So example being War Gecko. So now let's look at the Epic and Mystic runes. So first one, Calcium Armor, solo. So all the Epic and Mystic runes now have solo, meaning you can only have 1 of this rune in your team. And for Calcium Armor, what it says is that when your turn starts, this actually gains shield equal to 10% of its max HP. So I feel like this is a very strong passive buff. It basically gains you 40 shield per round. So every round you gain around 40 shield, and of course if you buff your max HP a bit, then it could be like 45 or even 50 shield if you have 500 max HP. And over 10 rounds, assuming that this Axie survives for 10 rounds, so cumulatively it can gain over 400 shield just by using this rune. So I feel like this rune has a very big potential. But of course the downside is that for shield, you might not always gain an advantage. It's only when the opponent hits into you, and if the opponent has way of hitting into other Axies, then you might not get this value. But still, I think very strong. But there are also other ways in which you can use shield, especially a lot of bug cards that uses shield. An example being Square Teeth, which uses your shield to attack the opponent. So yeah, there's definitely a way of building around this rune. Okay, next up we have Giant Bubble. So Giant Bubble is solo. Add one Giant Bubble to this Axie's card list. So basically you add another card. So effectively you have 19 cards instead of 18 cards. And what Giant Bubble does is that it has Retain, Innate. All Axie gain one bubble, and it's a 0 cost card. If retained, its energy cost +1, add 3 bonus bubble, and cap at 5 rounds. So retain meaning it will always stay in your hand, and innate means it will start in your opening hand. So it's a 0 cost card, so you can obviously play it at the very first turn. And note that there's no banish or anything, so basically this card will continue to be in your deck, and so you can play it over and over again throughout your deck rotation. The interesting part really is whether to retain this card or not, because of course once you retain, it increases the energy cost, and at some point you will have to play it, otherwise it's unplayable. So that is the downside of this card. Usually I assume you will probably want to play it at 0 energy, and you get effectively 3 bubbles, assuming that you have 3 Axies. And assuming that each bubble does 12 damage as mentioned before, and effectively this is a 0 energy cost, deal at least 36 damage, and of course I haven't taken into account the bubble buff for single attacks. And if you retain it for 1 turn, then it gives you 4 bubbles across the board, and this actually gives you 144 damage overall. So I feel like that is very strong. Using 1 energy, gaining 144 plus damage, I think is probably the right way to go. But of course, depending on how desperate you are, you do lose on tempo. So that's the downside of using 1 energy just to get the buff. Yeah, but I can see that this is gonna be played usually at 0 and 1 cost, but of course I can imagine this can also be used to fill in the energy kind of gap. Let's say if you have turns where you don't really have cards to play and you have extra energy, then you can kind of fit it in. But of course the downside is that if you retain it for too long, it gets to a point where you need 5 energy to play it, right? Because you can retain it for 5 rounds. And it's probably not too feasible. Even at the late game, you use 5 energy just to play buffs and not attacking. And do note that this card can be played over and over again, so I can imagine this is gonna be a very strong card. Playing at 1 energy or even 0 energy. 1 energy for 144 damage is very strong, especially early game. Of course, late game, then if you don't have 3 Axies, then the damage will be definitely be a bit lower, but still, yeah, I would be interested to see how Bubble Teams uses this to gain a lot of bubbles and deal a lot of AoE damage. Okay, finally we have Heart of Ocean. So it's the Mystic Rune of Aqua. As a solo, when your turn starts, this Axie gains 1 bubble. And Bubble Bomb detonates, but this Axie deals 1.5 damage. So it's really definitely a bubble kind of build. And 1 bubble in this case deals 18 damage. For the Axie of Heart of Ocean, because of the Bubble Bomb detonates, but this Axie deals 1.5 times more damage. So you can imagine if this Axie survives for 10 rounds, then it will give you 10 bubbles, and then that's basically giving you 180 damage. To be honest, I must say, of course, the bubble is good, but it's not actually very strong. I think you do need to add additional bubbles through other means, like Giant Bubble, and of course you'll see other cards and charms that adds bubble. And with those additional bubble, I think Heart of Ocean is gonna be a strong rune. Okay, next up we have the charms, and The charms basically tells you what Aqua is good at. So in this case, it's mostly about doing damage through single attack and also multi-hit and AoE attack, but I think mostly single attack. The right 4 charms also tells you a bit about the different ways in which you can play Aqua. So let's look at Aquatic Energy Drinks S. So it's a charm that you can put on any card. And so it says this actually gains 2 bubble at the grade. So first of all is 2 bubbles means 24 extra damage effectively. So basically adding 24 damage is very strong. But of course coupling with other effects like the Heart of the Ocean, then this becomes even stronger. But do note that there's this caveat, which is degrade. And what degrade means is that when your turn ends, if this card is still in your hand, instead of being discarded, this hand is exiled and a confused card is shuffled into your discard pile. Basically, when you draw this card and if you don't play it in that turn, then this card will be gone and you actually get a confused card shuffled into your discard pile. So that is the downside. So I've looked into all the Aqua cards, but unfortunately for all the 0 cost card for Aqua, they all have like a banish or a similar kind of mechanic, so you can't really play it multiple times. And if you want to use this charm multiple times throughout the game, then you probably have to put it on one of those 1 cost energy card. And this can be annoying because it kind of forces you to use that card every time you draw it. So yeah, so that's gonna be interesting. But it does have a very strong effect, so you probably would want to put it on a card where you will definitely play it if you draw it. So next up, Bubble Paste. It can be put on any card. And now it says other allied Axies gain 1 bubbles. So now not all Axies get bubble, it's only all other allied Axies. So in a way you can only get a maximum of 2 bubbles when you use the card with Bubble Paste. So 2 bubbles, 24 damage, I would say not bad, quite a consistent way of getting bubbles with no downside, but of course it assumes that all your Axies is alive to get 2 bubbles, otherwise you only get 1 or even 0 bubbles. And this is gonna be not so good at the late game where you only have 1 Axie left. Okay, next we have Sticky Octopus. Again, can be put on any card. And it basically adds retain to that card. And retain, what it means is that this card will not be discarded from your hand at the end of your turn, meaning you can keep this card. So I think retain is always a very strong mechanic, so you can keep the card and choose the perfect moment to play the card. And in this case, there's another bonus as well, is that if retained, this card grants 1 bonus energy fragment when played. So another way of ramping, but of course there's only 1 bonus energy, so it's not that much. Having said that, of course you can run multiple Sticky Octopus, so those could all add up and give you an advantage over your opponent. And finally, we have Paralyzed Jellyfish. So this one can only enhance any attack card, so it has to be on attack card. And it says attack shuffle 1 Jinx into opponent's discard pile, and I think this one can be pretty strong if you run multiple copies of Paralyzed Jellyfish, and of course with other cards that shuffle Jinx into opponent's deck as well. Okay, what Jinx does now is that it's still a curse card that is unplayable and ethereal, meaning an opponent will draw it and they can't do anything with it, and it'll be gone at the end of the turn where the opponent draws it. And what Jinx does now is whenever this card is drawn, your furthest Axie receives 10 damage plus 5 more damage per bad luck stack. Then apply 1 bad luck to that Axie. So basically, it deals 10 damage to the back, and every time the opponent draws Jinx, you put the bad luck debuff onto the furthest Axie, and assuming the opponent doesn't cleanse it or anything, then the bad luck debuff kind of piles up, I assume. Here I have actually a kind of like a table where it shows you how much total damage you will deal depending on how many Jinx cards the opponents draw. So the first one is just 10 damage, but you can see it adds up. So the second one you will be dealing 15 damage, so in total will be 25, and then the third one will do 20 damage, then the total will be 45. So you can see that if you just put 5 Jinx cards in your opponents, you are already dealing 90 total damage. And of course this is on top of the draw disruption, which traditionally was the main reason why you run Jinx, but now it really gives you an additional reason of running Jinx, because this is just gonna be damage ramping up if the game drags on. So yeah, interesting to see if there will be any Jinx kind of team that could be strong. So from the charms and the runes, you can tell that there are a few things that Aqua are doing. So one, of course, the main one is the bubble mechanic. And second one is actually ramp. So you can see that there are quite a number of ways in which you can ramp, meaning gain bonus energy fragment using Aqua runes, card, or charm. And finally, maybe Jinx could be a thing as well with this paralyzed jellyfish charm. So yeah, and we'll see how good Jinx could be in this season. So now let's get into the cards. And first we have Eyes, and as usual the first one is a 0 cost card, and it's Telescope. And what it does is that if initial, so if it's the first card that you play in the turn, then select one aquatic card from your discard pile, otherwise select from your draw pile. So for that card, you put the selected card on top of your draw pile, and then banish this card. So meaning you choose one card and then you put it on top of your draw pile, so you will draw it next turn. And banish means after you use this card, this will be moved into the banish pile. So basically you won't get to draw it again through your deck rotation. So basically it's like a one usage kind of card where you just use it once per battle. Okay, next we have Clear, also a 0 cost card, and it's a skill card which says draw 2 cards, then discard 2 from your hand, unstable. So now it's a pretty good card, I think, because basically it gives you option. You draw 2 cards first and then you decide which 2 to discard, meaning you can always just discard the 2 that you draw as well, so you don't have to decide on which one to discard first. So now you draw first, so I think can be pretty strong, but of course there's downside, and unstable means once used the card disappears and a confused card will be shuffled into your discard pile. So basically you can only use this card once per battle, and also you'll make your next deck rotation a bit worse by having a confused card. So basically you're trying to improve your draw consistency at the current turn at the sacrifice of future draws. So next up we have Sleepless. So it's a very standard 1 cost 60 attack card, and it says select the closest or furthest enemy, and this is like a theme that you'll see in other Aqua cards as well. And on top of that, Sleepless also apply vulnerable to the target for 2 turns, and vulnerable has been a very strong aggro kind of debuff, and it's a debuff applied on an opponent where it says the target receives 20% more attack damage. So basically you apply vulnerable on the opponent and then you're gonna hit them 20% harder. So let's just talk about the first mechanic first. So select the closest and furthest enemy, I think can be very strong, because first it can let you bypass the front. So let's say the opponents might play shield, they usually play at the front, then you can bypass the shield and just hit to the furthest Axie instead. And the other thing is, of course, traditionally people might want to put their strongest Axie or the Axie that deals the most damage or want to be protected at the back, and in this case you can actually target the furthest enemy directly. Well, of course the opponent has different ways of playing around it, so maybe now you'll see that people will want to put the most important Axie at the mid just to counter this kind of effect that Aqua has. And the opponent can also play a summon at the furthest slot, and so because this does says furthest enemy, not enemy Axie, so you will target the summon as opposed to the back Axie, so that's another way of playing around it. So for vulnerable, I think it's going to be quite strong in an attack aggro kind of build, but it's only for 2 turns, meaning it's really only the turn that you are using Sleepless where you get to use the vulnerable benefit. So definitely not as strong as, say, Little Piece from before where it does vulnerable for 4 turns, but still I think it's a good option. And next we have Jero. So it's again a 1 energy cost 60 attack card, and this one says if the target has fragile, deals 20 bonus damage. Otherwise apply fragile for 4 turns. So another good option for aggro attack kind of build, especially with some fragile synergy, because it does 80 damage per energy if the target has fragile. And even if the target doesn't have fragile, applying fragile for 4 turns can be quite strong against team that relies on shield like poison and sustain. And what fragile does is that fragile is a debuff that applies to the opponent, which says this unit gains 40% less shield from abilities. So definitely gonna be strong against opponent that relies on shield. And next we have Ears. So for Ears, we start off with Nemo. It's a 1 energy cost 50 shield card. It says target any ally, gain 1 energy fragment. Gain 1 bonus energy fragment per Nemo card in your deck, capped at 3 Nemo cards. So that just means in a maximum you can gain 4 energy fragments, because at the base level it gains 1 energy fragment, and you can run 3 other Nemo cards. Reason being, there are actually another Nemo card, which is a tail card, which I show here, which we'll talk about later as well. So basically it's a 1 energy gain 4 energy fragment card, which I think is gonna be quite a strong ramp card. Of course you sacrifice a bit on tempo where you only have 50 shield, but still I think it can be quite a big ramp, and you'll see that ramp is gonna be a theme in Aqua. And do note that this Nemo doesn't have banish, so meaning you can actually play it over and over again throughout your deck rotation. And next we have Bubble Maker, 1 energy 70 shield card, and it has a return mechanic. And what return does is that if this card is not used, put it onto the top of your draw pile at the end of your turn. So basically if you don't use this card, you will draw it again next turn. But the downside is that you rotate through your deck a bit slower because you're putting this card back onto your draw pile. So this card can target any ally, as for most shield cards now. When your turn ends, if not played, other allied Axies gain 1 bubble, which is an interesting kind of mechanic, because it's the kind of card where you just never want to play it, and if you don't play it, you gain 2 bubbles, assuming you have all 3 Axies alive, and that's basically at 24 damage without playing a card. The main downside is that it actually slows down your draw, and you don't draw as many fresh cards for your future turns. So it's an interesting kind of sacrifice. Yeah, so it's gonna be interesting to see whether it's worth it to not draw as many fresh cards and gaining bubble. So I can see that this card can be quite strong in a bubble kind of team. And next we have a crazy card. Is a 9 energy cost card that deals 400 damage. So basically if the opponent doesn't have any buff in terms of HP or shield, then it's just one shot, 1 Axie in 1 hit. But of course being 9 energy is usually unplayable, and let's just see how it works. So it has retain, meaning you just keep this card in your hand after you draw it, and it says this card costs 9 energy. Reduce the energy cost of this card for each level of your energy burst. So it definitely synergizes with the ramp mechanic or gaining energy fragment kind of mechanic, because once you get enough energy fragments, then you get energy burst. And so the earliest you can play this card is at the 3rd level of your energy burst. So at the 3rd level of the energy burst, you'll have 6 total energy, and this card will cost 6 energy. And I'm pretty sure there will be people who are trying to make this card work, just because it's pretty fun to play in general, and yeah, getting a lot of ramp. And of course ramp in itself is already a very strong effect, I feel, because you get to use more energy and have more card draw faster than your opponent. So that in itself is already a strong mechanic. So having Tiny Fin as a finisher could be pretty strong. Having said that, if you use Tiny Fin with 6 energy, then you're basically doing 66 damage per energy, which I must say is not that strong. And if you play this at 6 energy, opponent probably have 5 energy as well, and so they can just play 5 attack card and KO you as well. So yeah, I'm still trying to think whether this is like a good card, and maybe you have to make it to the 4th level of energy burst, meaning you have like 7 energy in order to be worth it. But I have no idea how easy is it to get to the 4th level of energy burst. They're definitely good against sustain, because for sustain then you basically can one-shot them at the late game. But for other matchup, I'm not too sure. Okay, next we have Inkling. So Inkling is a 1 energy cost, 60 attack card. Again, is target the closest or furthest enemies. So you'll see this over and over again in Aqua attack cards. So this one, shuffle 1 Jinx into your opponent's discard pile. So this is kind of like a Jinx synergy kind of card. So if you count the Jinx, it already deals at least 70 damage per energy, so I would say not bad. But of course on top of that, if you play on the Jinx synergy, then it can deal a lot more damage, just because the Jinx gives you the bad luck debuff. So this kind of card definitely gives Jinx energy some hope. Okay, next up we have Gale. So Gale is an AoE card, 1 energy, 20 damage to all enemies, including summons. And the effect is that all ally Axies gain 1 bubble. So assuming that all 6 Axies are alive, then you do 60 damage of AoE, plus you gain 3 bubbles because all ally Axie gain 1 bubble. So effectively it's a 96 damage per energy card in the early game when all 6 Axies is alive. So yeah, I think it's going to be quite interesting in a bubble build, where this is one of the ways in which you can gain bubble efficiently. And finally for ES we have Sea Slug. Again, 1 energy, 60 attack card, and this one cleanse 1 time and gain 1 cleanser. So yeah, I quite like this one, but do note that cleanse and cleanser now got a bit of a nerf, so it can only remove 3 stacks or up to 3 turns of the debuff. But still, I think it's going to be quite a good tech card against team that relies a lot on debuff. Okay, next we have Mouth. First one, Lamb, and it's a 1 energy cost, 95 damage card. It of course looks very strong at the base level, but if you look at the card text, it says target the enemy Axie with the lowest HP. And Lamb deals 25 less damage per 25% HP the target is missing. So I think the last sentence really hurts Lamb. Obviously Lamb is very strong in the early game where all Axies are at full health and it basically deals 95 damage, but at the late game you probably don't want to use Lamb. Here I basically have the damage that you will deal depending on the target's HP, and if it's above 75% you deal 95 damage, which is pretty good. But do note that Lamb targets the enemy with the lowest HP. So let's say if the opponent has a very weak Axie, then you'll deal a lot less damage. If the opponent has 50 to 75% of the max HP, it deals 70 damage, which is still okay. But then, if the opponent is below half health, like at around 25 to 50%, then Lamb only deals 45 damage, which is already pretty bad. And what's worse is that if the opponent is below 25% health, then it only does 20 damage for 1 energy. And I think that's really the compromise in using Lamb. So it's gonna be interesting to see whether people will actually want to run this card just for the early damage, but it adds to the inconsistency late game. So next we have Catfish. So it's another AoE card, 1 energy, 20 AoE, attacks all enemies including summons, and again all ally Axie gain 1 bubble, so basically the same effect as Gil. So effectively you can think of it as running 2 copies of Gil on the same Axie. So again, going to be quite strong on a bubble build, I think, because you do gain 3 bubbles assuming all your Axies are alive. Okay, next, Risky Fish, 1 energy, 70 attack card, and it says if initial deals 15 more damage. So basically it deals 85 damage if you play it at the first card of your turn. But the downside is that it applies Fear to self for 3 turns. And what Fear is that it's a debuff that you apply to yourself in this case. And it says whenever this unit uses an attack card, shuffle a Confuse into its draw pile. And a Confuse is basically a curse card that basically disrupt your draw because it's an unplayable card, so that means you can't do anything with it. And it's for 3 turns, meaning it applies in the current turn, so you might not want to use another attack card for this Axie anymore, because otherwise you will shuffle Confuse card into your deck. And now it also applies to your next round, and I think that's going to be tough, especially for aggro build where you mostly just have attack cards. Okay, next we have Piranha. So it's a 1 energy, 50 attack card. Again, you can target the closest or furthest enemy. In this case, steal HP equal to 40% of unblocked damage. And I think this one could be pretty strong. So what steal HP does is that you basically deal pure damage to the opponent and then you also gain that HP. And pure damage means you ignore the opponent's shield and just deal damage to the HP. So assuming the opponent actually doesn't have any shield, then you do 50 base damage. And then you steal basically 20 HP because it's 40% of the 50 damage. And so in total you already deal 70 damage assuming the opponent doesn't have shield. And on top of that you also heal for 20 as well because it's stealing HP. So effectively it is a 90 effect per energy kind of card, and it allows you to target the closest or the furthest enemy. So meaning if the opponent plays shield, then usually if they play at the front, then you can choose to target the back. But of course, there's a bit of a mind game as well, because usually shields are secret, so you might not know where the opponent played the shield. But still, you can always test it out with your other attack card first, and then use Piranha. Okay, next up we have Back. The first one is a 1 energy secret, no shield, but target any ally negates the next attack on this target. So this one has not been the strongest card, especially against AoE and multi-attack kind of card. But I can imagine it could be good against single attack burst damage kind of build, so I'm thinking about Rage and Fury kind of build. But usually the opponents will probably still test it out before they go into the burst damage. So yeah, I'm not too sure how good Hermit is gonna be. And next we have Blue Moon, 1 energy 60 attack card. In this case, again, target the closest or furthest enemy. And it has a limit 3, meaning you can only play 3 of the similar kind of card. I assume or the draw 1 card kind of card, you can only play 3 per turn. The 4th one you play doesn't have any effect, that's what I would assume. And yes, the effect is draw 1 card. So I think this card can be pretty strong. 1 cost 60 attack and draw you 1 card. And also be able to target closest or furthest enemy. I think, yeah, we'll definitely see play because it does add to your draw consistency and also rotate your deck faster. Next, Goldfish, 1 energy 60 attack again. And this one says if you have at least 1 skill card in your hand, gain 2 energy fragments. So this is actually quite interesting in terms of the building of your team, because let's say in aggro build you might not run that many skill cards, then you might not actually gain this 2 energy fragments. So you would actually want to play in a build where you have quite a number of skill cards and also have this attack card to ramp. So yeah, it's gonna be quite interesting to see what kind of team Goldfish fits into, and definitely some ramp team with some sort of either secret or healing or shielding or something. So yeah, interesting. And next we have Sponge. So wow, it's now a 3 energy cost skill card and it has retain, meaning it will stay in your hand after you draw it. You can target any ally and it converts all bubbles on the target into bubble bomb. If you remember, 1 bubble bomb effectively equals to 60 damage, assuming the opponent has 3 Axies alive. And the maximum number of bubbles you can have is 4 bubbles, because after you get 5 bubbles, then the bubbles will be converted into bubble bomb. So assuming you have 4 bubbles and those convert into 4 bubble bombs, so basically you'll get 240 damage because each bubble bomb is 60 damage. And of course, you are taking away your 4 bubbles to convert into 4 bubble bombs, so those 4 bubbles is basically like a 48 kind of damage, and basically you have a net damage of 192 by using this card, assuming you convert 4 bubbles into 4 bubble bombs. And ultimately, if you count the damage per energy, it's basically 64 damage per energy, which I feel is not that strong. And so yeah, unless I'm missing something, this is going to be a very, very difficult card to play because you have to play at the right time. It's not too strong as well, and it's 3 energy cost. So I can see it as like a setup to a finisher, burst damage kind of thing at the end game, but otherwise it's going to be very clunky. And next we have Anemone. And it's a 1 cost 85 damage card, so base level very strong, but of course there's always caveat. In this case, it says whenever played, this card loses 30 base damage. Whenever you kill an enemy Axie with this card, all Anemone cards reset their base damage. So very interesting mechanic, because you basically want to use it as a finisher to finish off your opponent Axie, then the Anemone gets back to 85 damage. So you can see the first time you use it is 85 damage, but then the second time it'll be 55 damage, and the third time is 25 damage. So it's actually going to be quite difficult to kill opponent's Axie if you only have 25 damage. So sometimes when you draw it, and if you don't manage to kill your opponent Axie, it is going to be a bit of a dead card in your draw. But do note that there are actually 2 Anemone cards, so another one is a Horn card. And if you use any of the Anemone card to kill an opponent Axie, then all Anemone will get reset. So definitely gonna work in an Anemone team, which you might want to run like 6 copies of it, then it could be pretty strong. But otherwise, again, it might be a bit clunky to use. And finally for back, we have Purge. And this time I'll have to hide myself because I'm blocking the table. Okay, so for Purge is X energy. That actually means that there's variable energy. And let's just go into the card text. It says, consume all available energy. That means if you have 3 energy remaining, it will cost 3 energy. And it attacks all enemies, meaning it's an AoE. And it says base damage is equal to 100% per energy spent. Then deal 20 bonus damage per energy spent. Then you can see from the table, if you use 1 energy, then you deal 18 AoE damage across. So meaning 54 energy across the board. So not too strong, I must say, for a 1 energy 54 damage card. And annoyingly, it also doesn't really kill off the 24 HP summons as well if you only use 1 energy. So yeah, it's actually quite weak if you only use 1 energy. But of course, it's actually a very good so-called energy filler. If you have energy floating and you don't want to use other cards, then you can just use Purge, because the more energy you use for Purge, then the stronger it is. So if you get to 2 energy, then it does 42 across the board, which is already quite okay because it's 63 damage per energy. Once you get to 3 energy, then it's 72 across the board, so 72 damage per energy. Of course, these assuming that opponent has 3 Axies alive. Yeah, once you get to 4 energy, then it's 108 damage across the board. So I think it's gonna be a very strong finisher, because you can literally just use 1 card and kill off your opponent's Axie at the very late game. And of course, if you do get to 5 energy, then it's basically 150 across the board, which is 90 damage per energy. So I think it can be a good card in certain build where you might have quite a lot of times where energy is floating, or when you just want to have 1 card that does like massive damage at the late game. Okay, next we have Horn. First up we have Babylonia. 1 energy costs 60 damage again. Target the closest or furthest enemy. And this time apply vulnerable for 2 turns. So basically it's the same as Sleepless. So again, I think it's quite good that you have multiple ways in which you can apply vulnerable on the opponent. So strong for aggro team. But note that it's only 2 turns. And next we have Teal Shell. So a 1 energy base level 30 shield, which is obviously not very good, but it says target any ally. The target gains 20 shield per card played before Teal Shell this turn. So of course you don't want to play as your first card, but assuming let's say you have other 0 cost card, then you might get to a point where you play maybe 3 or even 4 cards before you play Teal Shell, and if you play 3 cards before it, it's already 90 shield, which is already very strong. If you play 4, it's 110 shield. If you manage to play 6 cards, let's say if you get some pure water or something, and then you can get to a point where you can have 1 energy for 150 shield, and there's really no limit to it other than hand size. So yeah, this can be a very, very strong card in certain build. So do look out for it, especially in sustained build. So next we have Clamshell. 1 energy costs 65 damage this time, and it gains 1 energy fragment if this attack costs unblocked damage, meaning it causes the opponent to lose HP as opposed to just hitting the shield. Then it gains 1 energy fragment. So I think it's a pretty simple way of ramping and gaining energy fragments. So quite like it, especially in those kind of ramp build. So next is Anemone. So I already talked about it in the back card, so I won't go through it again. The next one, Orangda. So now it's a 1 energy cost, 55 attack card, and it can target any enemy. So note that now you can choose which enemy to target, and it dispels the target 1 time. And I think it's gonna be quite strong because now you can choose which enemy to dispel. Of course, assuming that the opponent doesn't have taunt or anything. But now it dispels only 1 time, and dispel is kind of nerfed in the sense that now it only removes buffs up to 3 stacks or 3 turns. But still, I think it could be pretty good against certain builds that relies on buff, like bubbles or leaves or spikes or feathers, etc. So yeah, I think it could be a pretty strong tech card. So I think in Season 2 you'll see quite a lot of teams relying on those buffs. So Orang deck, I think, very strong. Finally, Shro Star. It's 1 energy cost card, so it's a skill card interestingly, but it does do damage. So now what it says is target any enemy. If the target has less than or equal to 90 HP and no shield, deal 90 damage to the target. So now very important is that there's this condition of no shield. If the opponent has even 1 shield, then Shro Star doesn't do anything. Because the condition only applies when the opponent has no shield, so now Shro Star doesn't go through shield anymore. And I assume by reading the card text, it doesn't really do anything to the opponent if the opponent has shield. And if the target doesn't die, so meaning either the opponent has more than 90 HP or the opponent has shield, or maybe there are some ways in which the opponent can prevent dying, not too sure. There are some rules that kind of get you back alive, but I still assume that those considered dying and then coming back alive, so that probably still means that the target dies. But anyway, so if the target doesn't die, then this actually deals 30 damage to self. So this is going to be quite annoying to play because now you don't really know if the opponent has shield, and because Shro Star doesn't go through shield, then you might not want to risk playing Shro Star. So it's definitely a strong nerf. But still, I think it's going to be good against Pandaren Scale Beast, that kind of thing, where you can still do 90 damage, which can be pretty strong. Okay, finally we have Tail. And for Tail, first up we have Koi, 2 energy cost card, now is 130 damage. Target closest and furthest enemy. So I think it's not bad, 65 damage per energy. And it's a 2 cost card, so sometimes it's good to have some 2 cost card if you are running a lot of 0 cost card. So I think it's an okay card for a certain kind of team. Now of course it also has the target furthest enemy trait as well, so you can basically do some backdoor and focus on the furthest enemy. Next, Nemo. So this Tail Nemo is 0 cost, so what it does now is gain 1 energy fragment. Select 1 Nemo card from your draw or discard pile and put it into your hand. So literally it actually puts it into your hand so that you can actually play the other Nemo card. So I can imagine you can just chain, let's say 3 0 cost Nemo card and then draw into the 1 cost Nemo card and play it. But of course it has banish, so meaning after you use it, it will go into the banish pile and it won't go into your draw or discard pile, so you can't just keep playing this card and gain infinite energy fragment. But still I think it can be pretty good for ramp. And also do note that it thins out your deck as well. So banish has this additional advantage, so meaning your deck rotation will be faster, so you'll get to the good cards faster. Okay, next up we have Tepal. 1 energy cost, 60 damage. Again, select the closest or furthest enemy, and this time shuffle 1 Jinx into your opponent's discard pile. So basically the same as Inkling, so I think it'll go well with a Jinx synergy team. So let's see if we have enough cards in order to make the Jinx synergy works. And I do feel like we may have enough cards to make the Jinx synergy works, but we'll see. Next, Renchu. Renchu now is 1 energy cost and is an AoE that does 20 damage, attack all enemies, including summons, and apply vulnerable for 2 turns. Yeah, so this reminds me of the old Grandma's Fan, but a bit weaker because it only applies vulnerable for 2 turns, where vulnerable is a debuff where the target receives 20% more attack damage. So I think it can be pretty good as a setup at the beginning of the turn. Then you can use other multi-attack cards or just attack cards in general. So I think it could be a good card for aggro, and it gives you a way of dealing with summons if you buff this card's attack as well. So yeah. Okay, next we have Navaga. And wow, this is an interesting effect. So it's a 1 energy power card, innate, so you start with this card in your hand at the beginning of the battle. So first do note that you can't target any ally Axie. You can only play it on yourself, meaning it can only be played on the Axie that has this card. And the effect is that whenever you have 5 energy fragments, they are consumed. After consuming 30, this effect stops, then the energy cost of this Axie's cards are reduced by 1 for the rest of the battle. Exile. So basically you are sacrificing 30 energy fragments to reduce the energy cost of 5 cards by 1 permanently in the battle. And 30 energy fragment basically means 2 energy bursts. Yeah, so I'm not too sure about the trade-off, but I think there will be people who will definitely play this card and make some very interesting team with it. I personally don't know how good it could be. So I assume you probably have to run quite a bit of ramp just to get extra energy fragment so that you can get to this effect as soon as possible, and also probably run quite a bit of card draw, because once you have 0 cost card and you'll get to a point where you can just play all your cards and you will still have energy remaining. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how people are coming up with ideas of playing with this card. And finally we have Shrimp, a standard 1 energy cost 60 attack card, and now it targets the furthest enemy. So a bit unfortunate now that you can't choose any enemy and you have to target the furthest enemy. And what it does is that it applies taunt to that enemy for 2 turns. So actually Shrimp can be a very strong card because basically you can focus all your attacks to the furthest enemy, which you normally cannot do. I say unfortunate because then the opponent can play around it in some way, but still having Shrimp in your team can do some mind game to the opponent where they might think that you have Shrimp in hand and they might have to protect the back Axie instead, that kind of thing. So it is still, I think, a very strong card, and it's only one of the 2 or 3 ways in which you can apply taunt to the enemy, and this is the most reliable one. So yeah, I definitely look forward to playing Shrimp, and I must say we probably will see more people shifting the most important Axie to the mid just because of all these aqua cards with mechanic that can target the furthest enemy. Okay, and that's it for Aqua. So hope you enjoyed this video. Do stay tuned for my other videos where I'll be talking about the runes, charms, and cards of other classes in Axie Infinity Origins. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.